Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Supernatural Hour. I'm sitting here with...
Raven. I love my new name, just so you know.
And...
Dawn.
This week, we're going to be talking about someone that they have named the Destroying Angel of Mormondom?
Yeah, that's a tricky word, huh?
It is.
I think it would be so cool to have a nickname of the Destroying Angel. That sounds...
Yeah, the Destroying Angel, I've read that he was also referred to as the Avenging Angel.
He's also called Old Port, but I think if I had the choice between Old Port or the Destroying Angel, I would definitely go with Destroying Angel.
So yeah, the Destroying Angel. Now this does have some ties into the LDS history a little bit, being that he was heavily involved in...
I would say a lot.
Heavily involved in a lot of the stuff that went on when the church was first formed, and that person is Porter Rockwell.
He's pretty much a stud, I've decided.
This picture of him I got here on my iPad looks really cool. I wish I could grow hair like his. I got the beard down. I can't do the long hair because I might be able to. His hair was kind of thinning on top too. I might be able to pull off the Porter Rockwell.
Yeah, I actually noticed that too.
So yeah, we're talking about Porter Rockwell, and I'm going to go ahead and let Deanne start us off.
So one of the things that I found interesting, if you grow up in Utah, if you grow up in this culture, in this church, you hear about him. Basically, he and Joseph Smith were neighbors. They grew up near to each other, and they've known each other their whole life. And he became Joseph Smith, and then subsequently Brigham Young, who came after Joseph Smith. He was their personal bodyguard.
Touch bases on how young Porter was compared to Joseph Smith.
He was
remember that?
8 years younger.
Yeah. So there was about an 8-year difference. So like 16 and 8 was the difference there. And they were pretty inseparable.
They were, and he was really helpful when Joseph Smith when it came time to publish the Book of Mormon. Porter Rockwell actually worked. He picked berries and hauled wood to help earn money to publish the Book of Mormon. So I mean, they were kind of in together very early on. But I knew that he was kind of a badass. Can I say badass?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was.
The FCC won't get us on this.
Excellent. So I always knew he was a badass, but I'm going to kind of jump. I mean, we're going to kind of jump around because his life was so interesting. It's going to be hard to go in chronological order. But one of the reasons he was called the Destroying Angel of Mormonism, and there's not a list of who he killed, but he's accredited to killing 24 to 100 people, and most of the time it was outlaws or defending his own life because people were coming at him because he was a marshal and a bodyguard. Yeah, he was a deputy marshal. And
he was he had a reputation of almost being unkillable.
Right.
That he was such a stud as a gunfighter for young guns to make their bones. It's like, well, I'm going to go shoot Porter Rockwell.
Right. But he was called the Destroying Angel, but it says that he killed more men, and I didn't know this until I kind of did some brush up for this podcast, but he killed more men than Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Tom Horn, and Bat Masterson combined. And he had like a hawk-like vision. They said that he could shoot someone riding off on a horse in the dead of night. He was so good. And one of the reasons that he couldn't be killed, or that he survived so long, is at one point Joseph Smith gave him a prophecy, and the prophecy basically said, if you don't cut your hair, you can't be harmed. Bullets won't harm you.
Or blade.
Bullets or blade can't harm you.
Yeah, from what I read, they referred to him as like the modern day Samson.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Don't cut your hair off. I believe he wasn't allowed to shave either. I don't know if that was a personal choice or if that was part of the prophecy, but yeah.
He didn't cut his beard or hair except one time.
Yeah, one time, and I'll let you talk about that. But yeah, from what I read, Joseph Smith basically said, as long as you have this hair and beard, you will not die by a bullet. Which was true. He ended up living a long life and died at home, I believe. But we'll get more into that.
Yeah, so it's right here. I wrote it down. He says, and this is quoted, says, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that you, Orrin Porter Rockwell, so long as ye shall remain loyal and true to thy faith, need fear no enemy. Cut not thy hair, so that would be probably hair and beard, and no bullet or blade can harm thee.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. So he actually died of natural causes. He was about 60-something, 65 or 67. So if you figure back in the 1800s, that was a pretty ripe old age. So he did cut his hair once. And the reason he cut his hair, Joseph Smith had a younger brother named Don Carlos. And Don Carlos's wife got typhoid, I think it was. Some illness, I think it was typhoid.
Don Carlos's widow. Because he had died.
Correct.
Yeah.
And she was losing her hair. So he did cut off his hair, his luscious locks, so that she could make a wig, which I thought was really sweet.
I understood he had the wig made for her and presented it to her. Yeah. But yeah, so that she had a wig so that she wasn't Porter Rockwell's hair.
Yeah. So she didn't go sneak and trick him and cut it while he was sleeping. He did it his own self. I thought, oh, he got this little badass gunslinger, but he cuts his hair off to make a widow a wig. Isn't that cute? And
it also talked about that he then went under an alias for quite a while till his hair grew back.
I didn't. That's
yes.
Funny. He's funny. So he was really quite known for his loyalty, and he was very relentless. Because he was very relentless and kind of badass, that's the word of the day, by the way. And I don't do the swears often, so be impressed or shocked.
I don't know if I consider ass a swear.
I do.
I can think of a lot worse ones.
Well, yeah, me too. So, because he was so relentless and fierce and, getting a reputation, he was often accused of stuff that he didn't do. He actually spent 9 months in prison once. And when you're in prison, you're never really treated great, at least at that time. Now you can get, your college degree and stuff. But at the time, you weren't really treated that great in prison. And he was in a cold prison. They didn't give him any bedding. They would feed him food that the dogs wouldn't even eat. And the reason he was here is because at the time, the governor of Missouri didn't like the Mormons, as they were called at that time. And he signed an extermination order.
Executive Order 44.
Yep, exactly.
Kind of like Order 66 in
here's the thing.
Star Wars.
The funny thing is they didn't rescind that until 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it would have been legal to kill Mormons up to about 15 years ago in Missouri.
Man, I missed out.
I know.
I'm just kidding. I have no wantingness to kill anybody.
But he didn't treat the Mormons very good, and so someone attempted to assassinate him, and they just automatically assumed it was Porter Rockwell, and so they threw him into prison, and he was there for 9 months, and they finally let him out. So
did you hear the story when someone asked Porter Rockwell if he shot Governor Boggs?
Tell us.
Porter Rockwell said he's alive, isn't he?
That's awesome. Well, Porter Rockwell,
his point was, no, he didn't shoot him because he wouldn't be alive if he had shot him.
Right. He had a quote that said, "I never killed anybody that didn't need killing." So, which I thought was kind of funny. He had some good one-liners like Brigham Young. Brigham Young had some pretty good one-liners. Something I learned. So back then, not a lot of people were terribly literate. In the mid to 1800s. More so than in the Middle Ages. But it kind of is hard to tell where, what's myth and what's reality, because he didn't keep a journal. The people that were literate back then, were heavy into writing letters and journaling, but he didn't. So a lot of this is, I don't want to say hearsay, but things that other people wrote, and some of it is legend. He was so legendary that things tend to get bigger and bigger. But even though he wasn't terribly literate, he was very business-minded. And he actually owned a hot springs hotel and brewery, which is near what we call the point of the mountain now. It's, if you're familiar with Utah at all, it's near where the state prison is. And it actually did quite well. And at its peak, it was producing 500 barrels of quality lager. I'm not an alcohol.
Lager.
I don't know how to pronounce that because
It's lager. Lager. Lager.
I don't drink the alcohols, so.
Oh, you're missing out.
So I don't know.
Not really.
So he was very business-minded. There are 2 statues of him in Utah. One is near where his brewery was. And it's funny because, he was a long-standing, very loyal member of the church, but he owned a brewery, which is just weird. And then there's one in Lehi, which is a town near where we're podcasting. There's a restaurant there. There used to be a restaurant there called Porter's Place, which was fabulous, and then they shut down, which hurts my heart because it was a really fun place to go to. They had good steak. And Porter's Place was crazy haunted. I personally can tell you there was at least 4 spirits there. And one time when we were there, we asked the waiter, and he's like, oh yeah, he says there's places in here that we won't go by ourselves. And we said, is the owner here? Would you ask him if we can come and investigate? And so he did, and the owner wasn't into that. But now that the restaurant's not there, I wonder if we can get in. I wonder if we can somehow...
There's only one way to find out.
Call and ask?
Yep.
So yeah, we'll have to do that. So... yeah, Porter's Place. So there's a statue of him by Porter's Place.
So in Mormon history, LDS history, people might be aware, that Joseph Smith was taken to the Carthage jail and then martyred there at the Carthage jail. The reason behind that was the burning of the Nauvoo Expositor Press, which had been orders given to Porter Rockwell to destroy the press, and he was involved with that is the thing. And kind of a thing of personal note there is my third great grandfather, David Norton Jr., was also indicted in that same action with Porter Rockwell. So they were more than acquaintances. They were kind of cohorts with things. And when Porter went to the gold fields in 1849, David Norton Jr. went there also, and his wife ran the first boarding house that Porter Rockwell had there in Northern California.
And as I read about him, I always knew that he was a gunslinger and, and a bodyguard and, a contemporary of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. But the more I read about him, I really earned a lot of respect for him. Like I mentioned before, a lot of charges were brought on him, because he was kind of the scapegoat. But at one point in Nauvoo, if you're familiar with church history, the church had quite a large city and a large presence in Nauvoo. And the saints were starting, the church members were starting to be persecuted. And so Brigham Young told Porter Rockwell, he says, we need to get some pressure off of the... I've written this down, it's funny. We need to get some pressure off of, the persecution from the saints. And so he was running around in the street shooting this gun above people's heads, just purposely trying to get imprisoned. And he was. They got him and they threw him into prison, and he basically went to prison because the prophet Brigham Young told him to. And he's like, all right, and he was married and had children, and I'll go to prison. But even though he's killed, and again, we don't have a number, between 24 and 100 men, he was very, he had a lot of integrity, and he didn't just go around killing anybody. In fact, Joseph Smith said of him, who is now a fellow wanderer with myself, is an exile from his home, like me, because of the murderous deeds and infernal fiendish dispositions of unrelenting hands of the Missourians. And it's just a history thing. If you're from Missouri currently, we don't think you're fiendish. You're totally cool now. Says he is an innocent and noble. He's an innocent and noble boy. And, I'm thinking, okay, you got this badass gunslinger and you've got Joseph Smith calling him a noble boy. But I have to remember, he was quite a bit, by quite a bit, 8 years older. May the God Almighty deliver him from the hands of his pursuers. Let the blessings of salvation and honor be his portion. So even though, he was a gunslinger and he was responsible for killing a lot of people, he was very noble and had a lot of integrity.
Yeah, and he was a sheriff and a marshal. I mean, these aren't, we'd say gunslinger, we're thinking about that in the sense of not a hired gun to go out and kill people.
And he wasn't a vigilante. It was usually, like he said, people that needed killing. I don't know that anyone needs killing, but he wasn't just out, shooting whatever for whatever reason. There was usually a reason. There were usually, a horse thief or, as part of his job. He was also well known in Hollywood. So there's an indie movie called Rockwell in 1994, and actually in that movie was Randy Gleave and Carl Malone, our very own Utah Carl Malone, in the 1940s, and I think it's actually a movie about Brigham Young, but it had Porter Rockwell as quite a main character in it, and it had John Carradine in it, a TV show called The Avenging Angel in 1995. There was a movie called Plan 10 from Outer Space in 1995 that has Porter Rockwell in it. In 1969, there was a TV series called Death Valley Days, which does not sound familiar to me because I
remember Death Valley Days. Yeah, they had the Borax team, and they showed the Borax 20-year-old teams carrying the things across. Yeah, I think Ronald Reagan used to actually be like the commentator or the host of that.
Oh, really? Yeah, I read that and I thought, I've never heard of that. But there was an episode called Son of Thunder, which featured... I've never seen any of these, so I can't tell you a whole lot about them.
I actually remember that, and I don't remember it as being a Death Valley Days one. I thought it was a Twilight Zone one, but I remember as a kid watching that episode about Porter Rockwell.
Well, Wikipedia says it's a Death Valley Days episode.
I will believe that.
And it says that there's actually an upcoming film called Out of Liberty, and it's his experiences in the Liberty Jail, with Joseph Smith. So one of his things, speaking of Joseph Smith being in jail, he was imprisoned, persecuted because of his faith, but Porter Rockwell actually snuck some tools into Joseph Smith when he was in the jail that Joseph used to try to escape, and he made like a 4-foot hole, and it took him several weeks to dig this hole. He didn't actually break through, but by the time...
That was Liberty Jail, correct?
I think so.
I don't think that was Carthage. I think that was Liberty Jail.
It was Liberty, that's what I said. So by the time they let Joseph Smith out, he was only just a few inches through a 4-foot wall to breaking through, so he almost escaped, but he didn't quite. But with help from his friend Porter Rockwell, bringing him stuff to dig through the rock wall.
Along that, with Joseph Smith and Porter Rockwell, I understand that Joseph Smith gave Porter Rockwell orders not to come to Carthage.
I think he was
explicitly ordered not to come to Carthage.
And then when he went, after Joseph Smith was killed, he kept following Brigham Young because he said, this is what Joseph would have wanted me to do. And he was actually invaluable as a scout, and helped the Saints when they came out west as a scout. And, he was Brigham Young's personal bodyguard, but he also protected, the other Saints and, looked ahead and made sure everything was safe where they went. Before we move off of TV, there's also a documentary made in 2010 called Stories from the Life of Porter Rockwell. And after reading this little bit about him, I always thought he was cool, but this makes me want to watch that documentary.
Okay, so there was a period of time where, because Porter Rockwell was a mountain man, it actually attracted the attention of a traveler named Richard Francis Burton. That actually, he came here to Utah to see Porter Rockwell. At the time, when he stopped in here, I believe it was in 1860, he was making a trip across America, and he ended up staying here in Salt Lake with a man named Lansdale Dayton. And this guy invited Porter to come have dinner with him. And when they were having dinner, Rockwell got a bottle of Valley 10 whiskey, and he and Burton actually went shot for shot throughout the entire night. And while they were doing this, Rockwell was actually outlining steps that Burton should take so he could pass safely to the Sacramento is where he was heading. He also advised him to carry a loaded double-barreled shotgun, to sleep in a dark camp, and to never trust appearances and to avoid the main trail, where the quote-unquote white Indians would prey on travelers. And the reason they called them white Indians is basically it was just the white people or white man would dress up as Native Americans or Indians and go around robbing people. So he's actually been able to help people kind of avoid situations like that.
So, since because we talked about how his hair, he couldn't cut it. And if you look at pictures of him, it shows his flowing locks, and they're actually kind of a little natural curl to it that makes me just a smidgen jealous. I mean, his hair looks thick and curly, and I'm a little jealous. But he would normally wear his hair braided and tucked into a bob. And after he cut it and, let it grow back, he, again, braided it and tucked it into a bob. And we talked about how he served as a scout and a game hunter for the Saints. And I found a cute little song. There's a little ditty that they made about him back in the day. Before you had Facebook, you had to just make up songs about people. So,
like Ring Around the Rosies?
Yes, like Ring Around the Rosies. Talks about the plague. So this little ditty says, "Have you heard of Porter Rockwell? He's a Mormon triggerite," which I think is a fancy word for gunslinger. Okay. "Have you heard of Porter Rockwell? He's a Mormon triggerite. They say he hunts for horse thieves when the moon is shining bright. So if you rustle cattle, I'll tell you what to do. Get the drop on Porter Rockwell, or he'll get the drop on you." So he was pretty famous back in the day. So one of the websites that I read was like his second or third great grandson giving, some of his take on his great grandfather. He says that he was referred to as a diamond in the rough. He abhorred deceit and intrigue. They said he was above average height. And so I thought, well, what's above average height? And as I did a little digging around, apparently he was 5'6", which would be above average height in the mid to late 1800s. They didn't grow him very tall back then. They said he was very quick in movement. He had strong arms and strong chest. He had gray, cool, and searching eyes. And if you look at the pictures, all pictures from the 1800s, the eyes look a little creepy, but you look at his and you can kind of see what they mean. He had natural curly hair. That was just my observation. And he was a very good businessman, like we said, with his brewery. He also, I think I'm going to say he had a sense of humor, just based on what I read. It says that he harassed Johnston. So when the Mormon pioneers came out to Utah and just started camping here, the federal government sent out an army, Johnston's army, and that gets into a whole other story, which we won't go into. Long story short, as it pertains to Porter Rockwell for our podcast, he went out and kind of harassed him and, caused him trouble and caused him delays, and just enough delay so that the pioneers here could get out of their homes and kind of prepare for this army to come. And so I can just see him having fun with that, being a scout and being a gunslinger, just really having fun.
Yeah, this was pre-Civil War. And the Mormons had actually prepared Salt Lake to burn it to the ground if Johnston's army came into Salt Lake. And they were able to negotiate an arrangement, and Johnston's army actually went south down into the Lehigh area. But yeah, they were ready to do that. But Porter Rockwell and others made it difficult for Johnston's army to come and do what they wanted to. And again, this was pre-Civil War.
Yep. So, we are the Supernatural Hour. We talk about supernatural things. And other than talking about a restaurant in Lehigh named after Porter Rockwell, and there's a lot of things in Utah named after Porter Rockwell, just so you know. He's actually buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery. Don and I have been there. It says that there was an area just west of our podcast area, called Eagle Mountain, that Porter Rockwell actually didn't like. Porter Rockwell himself thought that this was haunted, and he didn't like to go in this area. So I am going to read for you the story that I found. So it says, Orrin Porter Rockwell, a gunslinger, bodyguard, and deputy territorial marshal, thought that the area around Joe's dugout was haunted, and this Joe's dugout is an area out by Camp Floyd. It says, on occasion, Porter's young employee, Gundamson, was asked to ride with Porter from Lehigh to what is now Fairfield and Cedar Fort. About halfway there, a fellow named Joe Dorton had a little dugout in the hill from which he carried on trade with the soldiers at Camp Floyd. Dusk was approaching when Porter went up to the door of the dugout to inquire of Joe about an outlaw he was tracking. The sought-after outlaw himself came to the door of the dugout when Porter knocked. As Gudmundsson would later tell his family and record, the next thing he saw was Porter backing away from the door with his hands in the air while the outlaw pulled the trigger on his pistol. Gudmundsson testified that in the dark he saw a tongue of flame leap out of the barrel of the gun and said it looked as if the flames of the pistol were going right through Porter's chest and out his back, but incredibly Porter was completely unharmed. When the man's gun was empty, he threw it on the ground and ran up the hill behind the house. Porter came over to the wagon, took out his rifle, and shot and killed the robber. He went over to the body and threw it down a dry well. So this dry well has now become kind of infamous with some more modern stories. It says, this story leads me into a modern-day mystery about that well. An Eagle Mountain resident, which is a newer town that's kind of cropped up in that area, we'll call her Barbara, gives this account as told by her daughter. A couple of years ago in the evening, it wasn't super dark yet, that a man was walking. She said he walked towards the dugout before the fence was there, and there's a picture online, there's a fence around this dugout now, and went down in the hole. She watched and watched and watched for a long time, and he never came back out. She said he was wearing a regular jacket and a hat with flaps. She called my dad at work and told him about it, and when he got home from work, he walked over and never saw anyone there. Barbara said that the man was carrying a sack or something similar. Another incident is told by David, another Eagle Mountain resident. The story does not necessarily have anything to do with the well at Joe's dugout, but it did happen in that same area in proximity to the well. David gives the following account. It was 2:30 in the morning, and I was heading to work, and when I got by Hidden Hollow Elementary, all of a sudden I see this black shape heading north from the hill where people parked to go mountain biking. It almost looked like a shadow. I could tell it was not a deer. It was moving very fast, looking like it was running on 4 legs, but as soon as it got to Pony Express, it raised up onto 2 legs, and Pony Express is a road. And the feet were moving quickly. When it got up on 2 legs, it didn't slow or break stride, it just stood up and ran. David continues, it was like it made a transformation from an animal shape into almost human shape. When I got to the area, I tried to see if I could make anything out, but did not see anything. He talked about being reluctant to share his story. I kept quiet because I thought I could not have seen what I just did, but I know I saw something. Another resident had the same type of incident a few years previously. This is what he recorded that his sister experienced and shared it on a paranormal website. It was sort of cloudy and cold that night. The moon was out and it gave off a little light, but she could still see. I wasn't with her that night. I was safe at home watching a movie. When she was near the town park, a silhouette of something was near her. Upon closer inspection, she could see that it wasn't human. On one of the side streets, she saw that the shadow was one that looks like the whole bunch of different animals at once. May I remind you, she was not under the influence or hallucinating. So all this is real. She calmly started walking away as it came a little closer. My sister then turned around and started speed walking back to the house. Taking a few looks back, then she could see it never made any advances toward her after she had started speeding up. When she got home, she looked rather shaken up, shaky and pale. My other sister asked her what was wrong, and she explained the whole incident. Even though I was around 9 and gullible at the time, I still believe her to this day, especially from the look on her face told me that she had definitely seen something and it was definitely real. And I just find this interesting that, and I don't think it started with Porter Rockwell throwing the body down the well, because even before that, he didn't like going in that area because he thought it was haunted himself. So that would be an interesting area to go.
We should definitely go check it out sometime.
Go check it out. It's super close. It would be free because it's just outside. So
I like free.
Free's good. Anyway, so Porter Rockwell, cool dude. Watch the documentary. I think it'll be awesome. I'm going to.
There's a lot of stuff I didn't know that you mentioned that wasn't covered in the research I did. So that's really cool. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening about Porter Rockwell. Well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you next time.
Yep, talk to you later.
See ya.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at AdvancedParanormal.com.